Lavrentiy Beria is one of the darkest figures in the history of the Soviet Union, whose name still arouses horror and curiosity. His life is a tangle of secrets, intrigue, and cruelty. But what do we really know about him? Why did he become what he did? And how did he manage to keep power in the hands of a man who personally led mass repression for so long? Beria was born in Georgia in 1899 and quickly showed ambition. He was not a man who would have preferred to sit in the shadows. From the very beginning of his career, he showed that he was willing to go to any lengths to achieve his goal. After the revolution, he became one of the key people in the security organs. But his real ascent began when he became the head of the NKVD, the most terrible and powerful organization of the USSR. Beria got into the NKVD because of his incredible political ability and ruthless determination. He was a man who was not afraid to go head-to-head to achieve his goal. He first started working in the security organs in Georgia, and then, thanks to his connections and loyalty to Stalin, rose to leadership positions. He quickly established himself as a brutal and effective manager, capable of solving problems by any means. But the real leap to power came after Beria became head of the NKVD in 1938. This was the time when Stalin began to actively carry out the Great Terror, and it was necessary to find a man who could manage large-scale repression. Beria not only managed this, he turned the NKVD into an instrument of mass terror. He was absolutely prepared to make any sacrifice for the sake of following orders. Beria was personally responsible for the arrests and executions of thousands of innocent people during the Great Terror. It was under him that a large-scale purge began among party workers, military, and ordinary citizens who were often accused without any evidence. Under his leadership, the NKVD carried out mass shootings, and sentences were often based on false accusations. Expected enemies of the people could be listed even for a single unfounded word or rumor. An example is the famous Tukhachevsky case. This was a Red Army marshal whom Beria sent to the firing squad without a shred of conscience. Suspicion? Yes, he had a suspicion that Tukhachevsky might have been a traitor, although no real evidence was ever presented. It was at that point that Beria learned the art of manipulation. He realized that any action by the NKVD had to be swift and ruthless in order to create an atmosphere of fear that would silence people into submission. One of Beria's methods was that he himself conducted interrogations and decided who should be executed and who should be kept alive. And the choice often depended not on the guilt of the person, but on personal interests or revenge. He could sacrifice a person for personal offenses or for the sake of strengthening his own power. These were not accidents. Beria did not just kill people, he did it with calculation. After Beria became head of the NKVD, people began to disappear en masse. Arrests, torture, and shootings became the norm. But despite his brutality, he knew how to make sure that he was not touched in the political struggle. Lavrentiy Beria was not only one of the most terrifying people in the Soviet Union, but also had amazing personal connections that remained hidden from most. Beneath his outward appearance of a cruel ruler lurked a man with many dark secrets that still remain unexplored. These secrets concerned not only his work, but also his personal life, in which very strange and sometimes terrible things happened. The first thing that was not spoken aloud for a long time. This is his relationship with women. Beria had many mistresses, and not always they wanted it themselves. Often he chose victims, taking advantage of his enormous power and influence. One of the most striking examples is a young actress, Tatyana Okunevskaya, who fell into his field of vision. He began to pursue her, threatening to ruin her career and send her to the camps if she refused him. The girl had to obey because she understood. Beria can easily carry out his threats. She herself later said that she was subjected to persecution and pressure from Lavrentiy Beria. According to Okunevskaya's memoirs, Beria repeatedly showed an unhealthy interest in her, used power and threats to induce her to close relations. Later, the actress was repressed and spent several years in Soviet camps, which she wrote about in her memoirs. Her case is most often cited by historians as a vivid and tragic example of abuse of power by Beria for personal purposes. This story was not the only one. Beria often abused his power to get women to be with him. Beria, who was such a strong man and held many leaders in awe, showed weakness and insecurity in his personal relationships. He could not win attention naturally and used only threats and pressure. Another secret, which very few people knew about, was related to his family. Officially, Beria had a son, Sergo, who later wrote many memoirs about his father. But there was another son, a secret son, which Beria all his life carefully concealed. About the existence of this child knew only a few of the closest people. The most surprising thing, until now neither historians nor archivists have not found out exactly where Beria's secret son disappeared. Perhaps he was hidden, changed his name, or maybe his fate was much sadder and more terrible than we can assume. Beria realized that his position was extremely precarious and feared for his family. Perhaps by hiding his son, he was trying to protect him from the vengeance of his many enemies, should the situation suddenly get out of his control. From the very beginning, back in World War II, it was Beria who was one of the first Soviet leaders to openly suggest that Stalin create his own nuclear weapons. He realized that the bomb would give the Soviet Union a huge advantage over other countries and strengthen his own power in the Kremlin. Stalin entrusted Beria with this task because he knew that he would stop at nothing to achieve the result. Beria began to control all the work of Soviet scientists on the atomic bomb. To do this, he created a rigid system of secrecy and control. Scientists worked literally in conditions of fear. For example, the famous physicists Kurchatov and Karaton were under constant surveillance by Beria's men, and the slightest mistake could lead them to serious consequences. The scientists realized that any suspicion of betrayal could end in arrest or even execution. One of the scientists even later recalled, "We were afraid not so much of working with dangerous substances as of Beria's men, who were watching our every move." After the USSR successfully tested its first atomic bomb in 1949, Beria gained enormous power and influence. Not only did he convince Stalin of his usefulness, but he turned the nuclear project into an instrument of personal influence. But the most interesting and shocking part of his plan began after Stalin's death in 1953. When a power struggle broke out in the Soviet leadership after Stalin's death, Beria used the nuclear program as a means of blackmail. He hinted to the other leaders that he was the only one capable of controlling scientists and nuclear weapons. And if he was removed, the situation could get out of control and it would threaten disaster for the entire country. Beria, although he was a cruel man, he understood perfectly well how science and technology can be an effective tool to achieve political goals. He calculated in advance that nuclear weapons would be his personal guarantee of security and preservation of power. But did his plan work? Lavrentiy Beria was so powerful and influential that it seemed impossible to shake his power. But in reality, everything was different. The higher he rose, the more he became enemies, including among his closest friends. After Stalin's death, Beria immediately became the main contender for the place of the leader, but his methods and character have long frightened those around him. People he considered his comrades began secretly planning his elimination. Beria knew too much and was too dangerous. June 26, 1953, the unbelievable happened. Right at a meeting of the government of the USSR, Beria was suddenly arrested. The military was involved in the arrest operation. Personally, Marshal Zhukov participated in the preparation of the arrest. For Beria, it was a complete surprise. He was taken to a secret bunker where he became a prisoner of his own system. After the arrest, Beria was brutally interrogated with the use of torture. As a result of this pressure, he confessed to espionage, treason against the motherland, and collaboration with foreign intelligence services. It was on the basis of these confessions that his entire trial was based. This seems particularly surprising, since Beria himself had previously actively used torture and forced his victims to confess to things they had not committed. Beria's trial was as closed and quick as possible. Already in December 1953, he was found guilty of all charges. On December 23rd, Beria was shot in a special basement of the building. So ended the life of a man who was feared by millions and who personally decided the fates of hundreds of thousands of people. Many historians believe that the real reason for Beria's death is not his crimes, but the fear of his former friends and associates. Nikita Khrushchev and other Soviet leaders were afraid that if Beria consolidated in power, they themselves would suffer the same terrible fate as thousands of his victims. It was not only a struggle for power, but also banal revenge. The life of Lavrentiy Beria is the story of a man who had almost unlimited power, inspired fear in millions, but in the end became a victim of his own cruel system. Behind the outward appearance of a powerful and confident leader hid dark secrets, personal weaknesses, and mistakes that eventually ruined him. The figure of Beria still causes a lot of controversy and questions because many archives remain closed and some events will forever remain a mystery. Perhaps the worst secrets of this man are yet to be learned. If you are interested in uncovering other secrets and mysteries of the Soviet Union, subscribe to the channel. There are many more shocking and incredible stories ahead.